In this gripping true crime documentary, we delve into the harrowing tale of an innocent encounter that spiraled into a nightmarish tragedy. What began as a promising connection between two middle-aged individuals on a dating app soon unraveled into a horrifying sequence of events that led to a disturbing murder. This is the chilling story of how a simple Tinder date became the catalyst for an unspeakable act of violence. The story begins in the vast and often unpredictable world of online dating, where countless individuals seek connection, companionship, or even love. Among these many hopefuls were two middle-aged individuals, Richard and Laura. Each was navigating the complexities of life, and both were searching for someone to share it with. Richard, a man in his mid-50s, had spent years on various dating platforms, always on the lookout for someone who might understand him in a way that no one else had. His life had been a mixture of success and solitude. While he had achieved a stable career and built a comfortable lifestyle, his personal life had been marked by a series of disappointments. Relationships that started with promise always seemed to fizzle out, leaving him feeling more isolated than before. This time, however, Richard was determined. He believed that with the right person, he could finally find the companionship he had long sought. Laura, equally hopeful, had only recently ventured into the realm of online dating. After a long marriage that ended in an amicable divorce, she had spent several years focusing on herself, rebuilding her life, reconnecting with friends, and rediscovering her passions. Encouraged by friends who assured her that love could indeed be found in the digital age, Laura created a profile on Tinder, cautiously optimistic that she might meet someone with whom she could share her newfound independence. Her profile reflected her warm and caring nature. She described herself as an avid reader, a lover of the arts, and someone who cherished the simplicity of quiet evenings spent with a good book or a walk in nature. When Richard came across Laura's profile, he was immediately drawn to her. Her thoughtful descriptions, coupled with a few carefully chosen photos, suggested a woman who was both intelligent and kind, a combination that Richard found irresistible. He sent her a message, hoping that she might feel the same spark of interest that he did. Laura, who had been sifting through an array of messages from potential suitors, was intrigued by Richard's approach. His message was polite and engaging, not the usual trite or overly forward attempt at connection that she had come to expect. She decided to reply and thus began a conversation that would soon become more intense than either of them had anticipated. Their initial exchanges were light and flirtatious, touching on common interests like classic films, travel, and cuisine. Richard had a way with words that made Laura feel at ease, and she found herself looking forward to his messages, which were always filled with thoughtful questions and witty remarks. The two quickly discovered that they had much in common, not just in terms of hobbies, but in their outlooks on life. Both had experienced their share of disappointments and were seeking something real, something that could potentially lead to a lasting connection. Over the course of several weeks, their conversations grew deeper, touching on personal histories, life philosophies, and even their hopes for the future. Richard shared stories from his past, speaking of the challenges he had faced and how they had shaped him into the man he was today. Laura, in turn, opened up about her own experiences, including the difficulties of starting over after her divorce. As they continued to communicate, an emotional bond began to form. Richard was attentive, always quick to respond with insights that seemed to resonate with Laura's own thoughts. Laura, who had initially approached online dating with some skepticism, found herself becoming more invested in the connection she was developing with Richard. The exchange of messages became the highlight of her day, and she started to imagine what it might be like to meet him in person. Finally, after weeks of anticipation, they decided it was time to take the next step and arrange a date. The anticipation leading up to their first meeting was palpable. Richard and Laura had chosen a quaint, out-of-the-way restaurant that promised an intimate setting, a place where they could talk and truly get to know each other without the distractions of a bustling crowd. As the evening approached, both felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. Richard, who had been on numerous first dates over the years, found himself unusually anxious about this one. Something about Laura had stirred feelings in him that he hadn't experienced in a long time. He meticulously planned every detail, wanting everything to be perfect. Laura, too, was filled with a blend of anticipation and apprehension. While she was eager to meet Richard, there was a small part of her that worried. What if the man she had come to know through his words was different in person? When the evening finally arrived, Richard was the first to arrive at the restaurant. He chose a table near the back, away from the main flow of diners, where they could have a quiet and uninterrupted conversation. He checked his watch repeatedly, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and nerves. When Laura walked through the door, Richard stood to greet her, a smile spreading across his face as he recognized her immediately from the photos they had exchanged. Laura smiled back, a little shyly at first, but soon they were seated and the conversation flowed as easily in person as it had online. They ordered their meals and settled into what appeared to be an ordinary first date. The restaurant's cozy, dimly lit ambiance provided the perfect backdrop for their conversation, which started with the usual pleasantries. How was the journey? What they thought of the restaurant? How nice it was to finally meet in person. As they talked, Richard found himself increasingly captivated by Laura's presence. She was as articulate and engaging in person as she had been in her messages, and he was struck by how comfortable he felt with her, as if they had known each other for much longer than just a few weeks. The conversation soon moved beyond small talk as they began to discuss more personal topics. They spoke about their families, their careers, and their experiences with online dating. Richard shared stories from his childhood, painting a picture of a boy who had always been a bit of a loner, more comfortable with books than with people. Laura, in turn, spoke of her upbringing in a close-knit family, where love and support had always been in abundance. She told him about her children, now grown and living their own lives, and how proud she was of the people they had become. Throughout the evening, Richard listened intently, but there were moments when his gaze would shift, becoming almost too intense, as if he were studying her. Laura noticed this but brushed it off, attributing it to first date nerves or perhaps a sign that he was simply very interested in what she had to say. Still, there were small, almost imperceptible signs that something wasn't quite right. Richard occasionally interrupted Laura, steering the conversation in directions that made her slightly uncomfortable, though she dismissed these moments as social awkwardness. After dinner, Richard suggested they continue their evening at a nearby bar that he frequented. It was a trendy spot, not too crowded, with a relaxed atmosphere that encouraged more candid conversation. Laura agreed, hoping to prolong the evening in what she still believed could be the start of something meaningful. As they walked to the bar, Richard's mood seemed to shift slightly. The light-hearted banter they had shared earlier was replaced with a more serious tone. He spoke about his past relationships, hinting at betrayals and disappointments that had left him wary of trusting others. Laura listened sympathetically, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At the bar, they found a quiet corner and ordered drinks. Laura opted for a glass of wine, hoping it might calm the unease that had begun to creep into her mind. Richard, on the other hand, ordered a whiskey, which he sipped slowly as he continued to talk about his life. The conversation took on a darker tone as Richard began to open up about his frustrations with the dating world. He spoke of the many women he had met who had disappointed him, how they had failed to live up to his expectations, and how he was tired of being let down. Laura tried to steer the conversation back to lighter topics, but Richard seemed intent on staying in this darker space. He became more animated, his voice growing louder as he recounted tales of women who had wronged him, who had taken advantage of his kindness, who had left him feeling used and discarded. Laura began to feel increasingly uncomfortable. The man she had exchanged messages with for weeks, the man who had seemed so thoughtful and kind, was now revealing a side of himself that she hadn't seen before. As the evening wore on, Richard's behavior grew more erratic. He would laugh too loudly at his own jokes, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for something, yet he always returned his gaze to Laura with an intensity that made her uneasy. She started to feel trapped, as if she were being drawn into a situation she couldn't control. The casual banter they had enjoyed earlier in the evening was now replaced with a strained dialogue where Laura felt pressured to respond in ways that didn't feel natural. Laura began to consider cutting the evening short. Her instincts told her something was off, but she was also aware of how it might look to suddenly leave without a clear reason. She didn't want to be rude, didn't want to overreact, and so she stayed. hoping her discomfort was simply the result of first date jitters. But as the conversation continued, it became increasingly clear that Richard was not the man she had thought he was. There was a coldness in his eyes, a hardness in his tone that belied the warm, caring persona he had presented online. Richard, noticing Laura's discomfort, tried to reassure her with more jokes and anecdotes, but his attempts only made the situation worse, deepening the unsettling feeling in the pit of her stomach. She found herself smiling politely, nodding at the right moments, but inside she was growing increasingly anxious. The evening that had started with such promise was quickly turning into a nightmare, and Laura knew she needed to find a way out. As they finished their drinks, Richard suggested they move to a quieter spot, perhaps back to his place where they could continue talking without the noise of the bar. Laura hesitated, her mind racing with thoughts of how to politely decline. She didn't want to offend him, but the thought of being alone with him now filled her with dread. She made an excuse about an early morning appointment, thanking him for a lovely evening and insisting that they should do it again sometime. Richard's face darkened momentarily, a flicker of something cold and calculating passing across his features before he forced a smile and agreed that they should meet again soon. Laura quickly gathered her things, trying to maintain her composure as she made her way to the exit. Richard walked her to her car, his mood seemingly lightened, as if he were already planning their next date. But Laura knew there would be no second date. As she drove away, her heart pounded in her chest, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had narrowly escaped something terrible. Little did she know that this would not be the last time she would see Richard, nor the end of the nightmare that had begun that evening. Laura had driven home that night, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over her like a dark cloud. She had been on her share of dates, some good and some bad, but there was something about Richard that had left her feeling particularly unsettled. The intensity of his gaze, the way his mood had shifted so abruptly, and the dark undertone that had crept into their conversation, all of it lingered in her mind long after she had left him at the bar. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself that perhaps she was overreacting, that first dates were often awkward, and that maybe he was just nervous or misunderstood. But deep down, Laura knew something wasn't right. The next day, she busied herself with work, trying to push thoughts of Richard to the back of her mind. But he didn't make that easy. Richard sent her several messages throughout the day, each one more insistent than the last. He apologized if he had made her uncomfortable, blaming his behavior on the alcohol and the stress of trying to make a good impression. He expressed a strong desire to see her again, to make it up to her, to show her that he wasn't the person she might have perceived him to be. Laura hesitated before responding, unsure of how to proceed. On the one hand, she didn't want to be rude or dismissive. On the other, she couldn't shake the feeling that agreeing to see him again would be a mistake. After some deliberation, Laura decided to decline Richard's invitation for a second date. She carefully crafted a polite message, thanking him for the previous evening, but explaining that she didn't feel a romantic connection. She wished him well and hoped he would understand. Richard's response came swiftly. At first, it was measured and polite, much like the man she had initially believed him to be. He thanked her for her honesty and wished her the best. Laura felt a wave of relief wash over her, glad that the situation had resolved itself without any further awkwardness. But that relief was short-lived. Over the next few days, Richard's messages continued, growing increasingly erratic. He began sending long, rambling texts late at night, filled with confessions of how he had felt a deep connection with her, how he couldn't understand why she didn't feel the same, and how much it hurt him to be rejected. Laura was taken aback by the intensity of his messages. They had only met once, and yet Richard was acting as if they had shared something profound. She didn't know how to respond. Ignoring him seemed cruel, but engaging with him only seemed to encourage more messages. Eventually, she decided to stop responding altogether, hoping he would get the hint and move on. But Richard didn't move on. Instead, his messages became more frequent and more disturbing. He accused Laura of leading him on, of toying with his emotions, and of being just like all the other women who had hurt him in the past. His words grew darker, laced with anger and bitterness. Laura began to fear for her safety. She considered blocking his number, but something held her back, a small, nagging worry that if she did, it might escalate the situation further. Instead, she confided in a close friend, telling her about Richard and the increasingly disturbing messages he had been sending. Her friend advised her to be cautious and to consider reporting him if the situation worsened. Days turned into weeks, and although Richard's messages slowed down, they didn't stop entirely. Laura tried to move on with her life, but there was always a lingering sense of dread whenever her phone buzzed with a new message. She began to notice other things that unnerved her. A car that seemed to pass by her house a little too often. A figure that she thought she saw lingering outside her workplace. She tried to convince herself that it was all in her head, that she was being paranoid, but the feeling of being watched was something she couldn't easily shake. One evening after a particularly stressful day at work, Laura returned home to find something that sent chills down her spine. A bouquet of flowers had been left on her doorstep. At first glance, they seemed innocuous. An innocent gesture from a well-meaning admirer, perhaps. But when she opened the card that accompanied them, her heart sank. The message was from Richard. The words, written in a neat but unfamiliar hand, were simple. "I'm sorry if I scared you. I just want to talk. Please give me another chance." Laura felt her blood run cold. He knew where she lived. Panic began to set in. Laura quickly brought the flowers inside, locking the door behind her as she tried to calm her racing thoughts. She couldn't ignore it any longer. Richard was not going to go away quietly. She called her friend, her voice shaking as she recounted what had happened. Her friend urged her to go to the police, to report Richard's behavior before it escalated any further. Laura agreed, but there was a part of her that still hesitated. She didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to involve the authorities if she could avoid it. Maybe she could handle this on her own, she thought. Maybe if she ignored him long enough, he would get the message and leave her alone. But that night, as Laura tried to sleep, her mind raced with 1,000 scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. She tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside made her jump. She found herself getting up repeatedly to check that all the doors and windows were locked. The sense of being watched, of being hunted, was overwhelming. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, Laura made a decision. She couldn't go on like this. She had to put an end to it, once and for all. The next day, Laura went to the police. She brought with her the messages Richard had sent, the card from the flowers, and her growing fear that he was stalking her. The officers listened to her story, taking notes and asking questions, but their response was frustratingly cautious. Without concrete evidence that Richard had threatened her, they told her there was little they could do beyond filing a report. They advised her to block his number, to document any further attempts he made to contact her, and to call them immediately if he showed up at her home or workplace. Laura left the station feeling both relieved and helpless. She had taken the first step, but it wasn't enough to shake the fear that had taken root in her. For a few days, things seemed to calm down. Richard's messages stopped, and Laura began to think that maybe he had finally gotten the message. She started to relax, to reclaim some sense of normalcy in her life. But just as she was beginning to let her guard down, the nightmare escalated in ways she could never have anticipated. It was a quiet Friday evening when it happened. Laura had planned a low-key night in, a chance to unwind after a long week. She had just settled in with a glass of wine and a book when there was a knock at the door. Startled, she glanced at the clock. Who would be visiting at this hour? She wasn't expecting anyone, and her friends would have called before dropping by. Her heart began to race as she approached the door, a sense of dread washing over her. She peered through the peephole and her blood ran cold. Standing on her doorstep, holding another bouquet of flowers, was Richard. His expression was calm, almost serene, but there was something in his eyes that made Laura's breath catch in her throat. She didn't open the door. Instead, she stepped back, her mind racing with panic. How had he found her address? Why was he here? What did he want? Richard knocked again, this time more insistently. "Laura!" he called through the door, his voice muffled but still audible. "I just want to talk. Please let me in. I brought these for you. I'm sorry for everything. Laura's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what to do. Should she call the police? Should she try to talk to him through the door? Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, but before she could dial, Richard spoke again. This time, his tone was different, darker, more menacing. Laura, I know you're in there. You can't ignore me forever. Just open the door and we can talk like adults. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Fear gripped Laura like a vice. She realized with chilling clarity that this wasn't going to end well. Richard wasn't just here to talk. He was here to confront her, and she had no idea what he was capable of. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to get out of the house, but her legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot as she listened to Richard's increasingly agitated voice. Laura, please, he pleaded, his voice trembling with a mix of desperation and anger. I'm not leaving until we talk. You owe me that much after everything. There was a pause, and then in a voice that sent chills down her spine, he added, if you don't open this door, I'm going to have to do something I really don't want to do. Terror surged through Laura as she realized she was in immediate danger. She finally found the strength to move, backing away from the door and grabbing her phone. Her hands shook as she dialed 911, her voice barely steady as she whispered her situation to the dispatcher. Please hurry, she begged. He's outside and I don't know what he's going to do. Richard must have heard her talking on the phone, because the next thing Laura knew, he was pounding on the door with renewed fury. You called the cops? He shouted, his voice now filled with rage. Laura, don't do this. You can't do this to me. The pounding grew louder, more frantic, as if he were trying to break down the door. Laura retreated to the back of the house, locking herself in the bedroom as she waited for the police to arrive. The minutes felt like hours as she listened to Richard's furious attempts to force his way in. She could hear the wood of the door frame splintering, could feel the vibration of his blows through the floor. Every second was a lifetime of fear, of wondering if he would break through before help arrived. Then just as she thought the door might give way, she heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Relief flooded through her as the noise grew closer, and then suddenly, there were shouts outside, police officers ordering Richard to step away from the door, to put his hands where they could see them. The pounding stopped, replaced by the sound of scuffling and raised voices. Laura stayed where she was, too terrified to move, until finally there was a knock on her bedroom door. It's the police, ma'am, a calm voice called. You're safe now, you can come out. Laura hesitated for a moment before slowly unlocking the door. She was greeted by the sight of two officers, their expressions reassuring but serious. They escorted her outside where she saw Richard being led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of anger and disbelief. He shouted something at her as he was pushed into the back of a police car, but Laura couldn't make out the words. She was too shaken, too overwhelmed by the reality of what had just happened. The officers took her statement, asking her questions about Richard, about the messages he had sent, about whether he had threatened her before. Laura answered as best she could, her mind still reeling from the events of the evening. She was told that Richard would be taken into custody and that a restraining order would be issued. But the assurance did little to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She had narrowly escaped a terrifying ordeal, but the fear that had taken root in her heart would not be so easily banished. In the days that followed, Laura tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but the trauma of that night lingered. She changed the locks on her doors, installed security cameras, and took extra precautions whenever she went out. But no matter what steps she took, she couldn't shake the feeling that Richard was still out there, watching, waiting. And in a way, she was right. Though Richard was in custody, the damage he had done, the fear he had instilled, was something that Laura would carry with her for a long time. The nightmare that had begun with a simple online connection had nearly ended in tragedy, and Laura knew that she would never be the same again. She had learned a harsh lesson about the dangers that could lurk behind even the most seemingly innocent of encounters, and though she had survived, the scars would remain. In the aftermath of Richard's release from police custody, Laura tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but she was haunted by an unshakable sense of dread. The police had assured her that the restraining order would keep Richard at bay, that she was safe, but the fear that gripped her heart told her otherwise. She had taken all the precautions she could think of, changing her locks, installing security cameras, and even altering her routine to be less predictable. Yet despite her efforts, Laura couldn't escape the suffocating feeling that something terrible was still looming on the horizon. Richard, meanwhile, seethed with a mixture of anger and obsession. The restraining order felt like a personal affront, a declaration that he was a dangerous man, something he refused to accept. In his mind, he had done nothing wrong. Laura had led him on, toyed with his emotions, and then discarded him like he was nothing. He couldn't let it go. He wouldn't let it go. The more he thought about her, the more his anger festered, transforming into a dark, all-consuming fixation. He convinced himself that Laura needed to be punished, that she deserved to pay for the pain she had caused him. Despite the legal barriers in place, Richard began to methodically plan how he would confront Laura. He watched her from a distance, learning her new routines, noting the changes she had made to protect herself. None of it mattered to him. He was patient, biding his time, waiting for the right moment when he could finally make her understand the depth of his rage. Laura was unaware that Richard was watching her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. Every time she left her house, every time she drove down the street, she felt eyes on her. It was an intangible presence, but one that weighed heavily on her psyche. Her sleep was plagued by nightmares, vivid and terrifying, where Richard would break into her home and harm her. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, the shadows in her room seeming to take on sinister shapes. Each night was worse than the last, and soon she was running on little more than adrenaline and fear. One particularly cold and windy evening, Laura returned home after a long day at work. The wind howled through the trees, creating an eerie symphony that only heightened her anxiety. She hurried inside, locking the door behind her, and went through her nightly routine of checking all the windows and doors to ensure they were secure. Once she was satisfied that her house was as safe as it could be, she tried to relax. She poured herself a glass of wine and settled on the couch, attempting to lose herself in a book, but her mind kept wandering back to Richard, to the fear that he might somehow find a way to reach her. The hours passed slowly. Laura eventually drifted off to sleep on the couch, her book slipping from her hands as exhaustion overtook her. Outside, the wind continued to howl, masking the subtle sounds of someone approaching her house. Richard had been watching her for hours, waiting for the moment when the neighborhood would be quiet, when no one would notice him slipping into her yard. The darkness of the night was his ally, and he moved with a cold, calculated precision. Richard had learned her routine well. He knew that Laura, despite her precautions, often fell asleep on the couch in the living room, leaving her most vulnerable during these moments of unintended rest. He approached the back door where he had previously observed a flaw in her security, a window latch that didn't fully close. Using a tool he had brought specifically for this purpose, Richard quietly pried the window open and slipped into the house. The wind covered the sound of his intrusion, and he moved like a shadow, unseen and unheard. Inside the house, Richard's heart pounded with anticipation. He had waited so long for this moment, had played it out in his mind 1,000 times. Each step he took brought him closer to Laura, closer to the reckoning he had convinced himself she deserved. He could see her now, lying on the couch, the flickering light of a lamp casting long shadows across her peaceful face. For a moment he hesitated, a fleeting thought of what might have been if things had gone differently. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by the cold resolve that had driven him to this point. Richard moved closer, standing over Laura as she slept. She looked so peaceful, so unaware of the danger that loomed over her. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the knife he had brought with him, a blade that gleamed wickedly in the dim light. His hands shook slightly as he gripped the handle, his mind swirling with a mixture of rage and twisted justification. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Laura stirred in her sleep, sensing a presence even in her unconscious state. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she didn't comprehend what she was seeing. But as her vision cleared, the figure standing over her came into focus, and recognition flooded her with a wave of terror. Richard's face was twisted with anger, his eyes dark and cold. Before she could scream, before she could react, Richard lunged forward, the knife slashing through the air with brutal intent. Pain exploded through Laura as the blade plunged into her chest. She gasped, her breath hitching in her throat as she tried to fight back. But Richard was relentless. His rage fueled his attack, each thrust of the knife driven by the twisted belief that this was what she deserved. Laura's strength faded quickly as the life drained from her, her vision blurring as she stared up at the man who had once seemed so ordinary, so harmless. In those final moments, as darkness closed in around her, Laura's thoughts were a chaotic mix of disbelief and sorrow. How had it come to this? How had a simple online connection led to this violent, senseless end? The pain was overwhelming, but more than that, there was a deep, aching sadness. Sadness for the life she had lost, for the dreams that would never be fulfilled, for the people she would leave behind. Richard watched as the life drained from Laura's eyes, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had done it. He had finally carried out the act that had consumed his thoughts for so long. But as he stood there, looking down at her lifeless body, the satisfaction he had expected to feel was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was only emptiness, a hollow void where his rage had once been. The reality of what he had done began to sink in, the weight of his actions pressing down on him with unbearable force. The house was eerily silent now, the only sound the wind howling outside. Richard stood there for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. He had killed her. The woman he had once believed was his perfect match, the woman he had claimed to love, was now dead at his hands. Panic began to set in as he realized the enormity of his crime. He had to get out of there, had to leave before anyone discovered what he had done. But it was too late. The police had been alerted by a neighbor who had heard a commotion, the sound of something breaking through the wind. The authorities arrived quickly, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness as they approached the house. Richard heard the sirens, saw the lights, and knew his time was up. There was no escape, no way to undo what he had done. He dropped the knife, his hands trembling, as he backed away from Laura's body, his mind a whirlwind of fear and regret. The police stormed the house, guns drawn, as they confronted Richard. He didn't resist as they forced him to the ground, his face pressed into the cold, hard floor. The reality of his actions hit him like a sledgehammer. Laura was dead, and he was the one who had taken her life. The officers quickly secured the scene, their voices low and urgent as they worked to piece together what had happened. As Richard was led away in handcuffs, he glanced back at Laura's body one last time. The sight was too much to bear, and he quickly averted his eyes, unable to face the consequences of his obsession. The police pushed him into the back of a squad car, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed in the empty night. Richard's mind was a fog of confusion and disbelief. He had done the unthinkable, and now there was no turning back. Inside the house, the crime scene investigators began their work, documenting every detail, every drop of blood, every piece of evidence that would tell the story of Laura's final moments. The once cozy living room was now a scene of horror, the brutality of the attack laid bare for all to see. The police moved with a grim efficiency, their faces set in solemn expressions as they gathered the evidence that would seal Richard's fate. Laura's body was carefully taken away, the reality of her death a heavy weight on the hearts of those who had known her. She had been a kind, loving woman, someone who had sought nothing more than to find happiness in the wake of her divorce. But her life had been tragically cut short by a man whose obsession had turned deadly. The shock of her murder reverberated through the community, leaving her friends and family reeling with grief and disbelief. In the days that followed, the news of Laura's murder spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the world of online dating. Her story became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the dangers that could lurk behind even the most innocent of connections. The media latched onto the story, broadcasting the grisly details of the crime to a horrified public. People who knew Laura struggled to come to terms with the horrific end she had met. Friends and family members who had once seen her as a beacon of warmth and kindness were now left grappling with the senselessness of her death. The community that had once been a place of comfort and familiarity was now shrouded in a palpable sense of fear and sorrow. Vigils were held in Laura's memory, where those who loved her gathered to mourn the loss of a woman who had been taken far too soon. Candles were lit, and tearful tributes were paid as friends and family shared memories of a life that had touched so many. They spoke of her love for the arts, her dedication to her work, and her unwavering support for those she cared about. But beneath the sorrow was a burning question. How had this happened? How had a man like Richard been able to enter Laura's life and destroy it so completely? The trial that followed was a grueling affair, drawing widespread attention from the media and the public. Richard, once a seemingly ordinary man, was now the face of a nightmare, a symbol of the dangers lurking within the anonymity of online dating. His defense team attempted to paint him as a troubled individual, driven to madness by unrequited love. They argued that he had never intended to kill Laura, that it was a crime of passion born out of emotional turmoil rather than premeditation. But the prosecution, armed with the overwhelming evidence collected from the crime scene and the disturbing messages Richard had sent in the days leading up to the murder, painted a very different picture. They portrayed Richard as a man who had become consumed by his obsession, who had meticulously planned the attack and executed it with cold-blooded precision. They pointed to the restraining order, the previous encounters with the police, and the way he had stalked Laura in the weeks before her death as proof of his dangerous intent. Laura's friends and family were called to testify, each recounting the fear and anxiety Laura had experienced in the days leading up to her death. They spoke of her growing paranoia, the lengths she had gone to protect herself, and the unbearable tension she had lived with as Richard's obsession escalated. Their testimonies painted a heartbreaking picture of a woman who had tried everything to escape her fate, but had ultimately been caught in the grip of a relentless predator. When the time came for Richard to speak, the courtroom was tense with anticipation. His demeanor was subdued, almost detached as he addressed the court. He expressed regret for what had happened, claiming that he never meant to hurt Laura, that he had only wanted to talk to her, to make her understand how much she had meant to him. But his words rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence against him, and the cold, calculated nature of his crime was impossible to deny. The jury deliberated for several days, the weight of the decision before them heavy on their shoulders. The world watched as they wrestled with the evidence, trying to make sense of a crime that seemed both senseless and inevitable. When they finally returned with their verdict, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Guilty on all counts, Richard was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence brought some measure of closure to Laura's loved ones, but it did little to ease the pain of their loss. The man who had taken her life would never be free again, but the damage he had done was irreparable. Laura was gone, and nothing could bring her back. In the months that followed the trial, Laura's story became a rallying cry for change. Advocacy groups used her case as an example of the urgent need for better protections for victims of stalking and harassment, particularly in the context of online dating. Her friends and family channeled their grief into action, working with lawmakers to push for stricter laws and better resources for those in danger. Laura's death also sparked a broader conversation about the risks associated with online dating and the importance of recognizing the warning signs of obsessive and controlling behavior. Awareness campaigns were launched, and dating platforms were pressured to implement stronger safety measures for their users. Laura's name became synonymous with the fight for change, a tragic reminder of the consequences of unchecked obsession. As time passed, the community slowly began to heal, but the memory of Laura's life and death remained ever present. Her story was a stark reminder of the fragility of life, of how quickly things could spiral out of control, and of the importance of listening to one's instincts. Those who knew her held onto the good memories, the moments of joy and laughter, and the love she had shared with so many. They remembered her as a vibrant, caring woman who had touched countless lives and whose legacy would live on in the fight to protect others from the same fate. For those who had been closest to Laura, the pain of her loss never truly faded, but they found strength in the knowledge that her story had made a difference. They took comfort in the fact that Laura's death had sparked a movement, that her memory was being honored through the efforts to protect others from the kind of violence that had taken her life. In the end, Laura's life was defined not by the tragic way it ended, but by the love, kindness, and resilience she had shown throughout it. She had been a victim, but she was also a fighter, and her legacy would be one of hope, strength, and the enduring power of the human spirit.